Welcome everybody to the PCAS May 2025 General Membership Meeting. This is an in-person and Zoom combination hybrid meeting. And I want to welcome everybody for coming. Thank you. Tonight's speaker is Mr. Michael Tucker. The title of his talk is Unraveling the Mystery, Triangular Geoglyphs near Afton Canyon, a multidisciplinary investigation. Michael Tucker is pursuing a master's degree in anthropology through the Harvard Extension School with planned thesis completion and graduation in the summer of 2026. His strong academic background includes an MS in geological engineering from Missouri University of Science and Technology, an MA in strategic studies from the Army War College, an MA in science and biology from CSU San Marcos, and a BS in environmental science from UC Davis. Following a military parachute accident in September 2022, Mr. Tucker retired as chief game warden at Camp Pendleton and as a colonel in the Army Reserves. His distinguished military service includes 2 Bronze Star medals and a combat action badge earned during deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. He currently serves as an assistant director at VCS Environmental. And I want to make a special thank you for your service.
Oh, of course.
To our country.
It's an honor.
And also thank you for agreeing to address this meeting with this talk. And from now, I'm going to turn this meeting over to you. And we'll hold questions till to the end, and it's all yours. Thank you. Thank you, Michael.
Well, thanks, Joe, for that introduction. Thanks, Pat, for inviting me here. Thank you for setting this up. And I met some of us at dinner tonight. What a great group. And thanks for everyone showing up in person. But it's also nice to have so many people on Zoom. You know, we're all just people behind all these icons and names. And it's just nice that we can all share this space and these ideas together. I'm very thankful for PCAS for having a forum like this, and I'm happy to live close by. And you know, the publications that I'm reviewing, some of them come from PCAS, so it seems fitting that I'm here talking to you today. So I'm excited to be here. I'm honored to be here. I'll get started. So you can see on this picture, these are the geoglyphs that I plan on studying for my master's thesis. They're triangles. We're on a bluff, standing on a bluff when I took this picture, and we're staring at the geoglyphs, and then the bluff kind of falls downhill and towards the Mojave River. And to my back would be like the Baker area, or maybe like Barstow, you know, Calico, that kind of area across the way. And the Mojave River is in to the front. And if you go over that mountain, then you'd come across the 40 freeway. So we got the 15 behind us, the Mojave River in front of us, and the 40 past those mountains. That's where we're at there. All right, next slide. And I could switch these. I don't mean to burden you with that. You think maybe this right button, that do it? What have you there we go. What'd you press to do that? Enter. Okay. Enter. Well, new bathroom code, and we figured out the computer. We're on a roll. So this is what I'll be talking about tonight. I'll talk about the geoglyphs I'm looking at in particular. I'll talk about my background, and somebody at dinner said, it seems kind of weird or crazy, you know, I have this interesting background. But for me, it just seemed like it was a natural progression as I moved through life. But it gave me some different insights into these geoglyphs, and maybe it informs me a good way to design an experiment. So I'll talk about the relevant research that it goes into these geoglyphs, the Desert Serrano people that may have created them, and just geoglyphs in general, living in the desert, you know, different things like that, and then this experimental design that I'm working on. Well, thank you. So all these geoglyphs, they're all triangular. You could see in this, on the right side of this, there's a picture from Google Earth of the geoglyphs, and that's the bluff I was standing on the upper right, and then the riverbed, the Mojave River, to the lower left. Most of the geoglyphs are just about 1 by 2 meters, but you see some big ones highlighted there. Those are much bigger, but most of them are 1 by 2. And it's on public land, which is great because I'm able to get like a permit and conduct some research there. It's on BLM land. And all these geoglyphs overlook the Mojave River. They're not pointing in one particular direction, like it's one landscape feature. They're pointing in different directions. So I found these geoglyphs by looking at satellite imagery, just looking along riverbeds and using the satellite imagery to identify geoglyphs. My son and I, we went out to one set, and between when the satellite took the picture, and when we went out there, they were destroyed by off-roading activity. So we went to the next set that we were looking at, and it was these geoglyphs here, which fortunately had a metal cable around them, protecting them from off-road damage. So that's why I'm looking at these geoglyphs. Next slide, please. So thanks for the introduction. I was honored to work as a chief game warden and a wildlife biologist at Camp Pendleton, and I retired as an Army officer with 5 years of active duty, 18 years as a reservist. And for those of you who don't know, reservists, they're like part-time in the military, 1 week in the month, 2 weeks a year is like the classic idea, but it turns out that's just a gimmick to get you in the door. It's much more than that. And now I'm honored to work as an environmental consultant with VCS. It's a great company in San Juan Capistrano, but I get to work remotely. And it's just a great opportunity to use my natural resources background with in my home area in Southern California. And we covered the educational background, just undergrad at UC Davis. And it seems like a lot of education, but it all had a reason at the time. Like, I got a job as a wildlife technician at Camp Pendleton, and the way to move forward as a wildlife biologist was to get a master's degree. There's a great opportunity for me to research these artificial water holes or guzzlers on base. And I thought I'd turn that into a thesis. That's why I got the degree there. So it gave me these lenses to look at the world as a wildlife biologist. And then as an Army engineer, the Army said, hey, it's really easy for you to get a master's degree through Missouri University Science and Tech. You just have to, be in the reserves for a few more years if you do that. And so I went ahead and did that, and that gave me a new set of lenses to look at the world as geology, as a geologist. And then the Master's in Strategic Studies, that's what colonels go to the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And that's all about critical thinking and reading and writing. So that helped inform the way I'm putting together this thesis. And finally, I'm working with the Harvard University's Extension School, getting an MLA in anthropology. And I didn't have any experience with the Harvard University Extension School before, but I never imagined that I would have like a Harvard ID because, I'm out in San Diego, and that's an elite institution. Anyone can take a class at the Harvard University Extension School. But if you meet some certain standards and you put in an application, you can get a degree from them as well. So that's what I'm doing. So I'm working with Harvard faculty and all that, and it's been a great experience so far. And I'm married with 2 kids. I'm a San Diego native, and my son's back here, right behind me with a cool hat. Oh, that picture I put on there on the right side, that's me in the Philippines as an Army reservist. We're building a school for special needs kids in the Filipino countryside. And I put that picture because, if I want to be remembered for anything, it's hopefully as living a life of service, because I'm trying to give back in different ways. All right, next slide. So I'm gonna go through some of my life experiences and like the moral or the lesson that I learned from it that's helping inform my research. So it will all come together in a few slides here. But here's a map of Iraq, and you can see the Fertile Crescent here, or the 2 rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris, form that green area there. And I was there in the spring of 2003 for the initial invasion. And I moved from Kuwait. We drove up on a big road trip. We drove all the way up through Baghdad and then up to Tikrit and Saddam's home palace. And that's where we stopped. And I was living in Saddam's palace, and our job was to build a bridge over the Tigris River, which Saddam had flooded. It was like 536 meters wide, and we built a bridge over it in 4 hours. It was unbelievable, and tanks were crossing that river. And the bridge wasn't even built by sunrise, but by lunch, there's a good chunk of the division already crossed, and it was pretty neat. But what I noticed though, driving from Kuwait up to Tikrit, was that in the south, instead of seeing the green Fertile Crescent, it was just all dirt, all dry. I was seeing the Shiite people, and Saddam Hussein was not Shiite; he was Sunni. So he just took the water from the Shiite South, and the Shiite, they were, struggling a little bit how to survive. And so as we went further north and we got into the Sunni country, it was more green. People were eating better. It was a different experience up there. So I just looked at that and realized that humans could control the resource, and if you can control the resource, you can control how good life is for the people there. All right, next slide. I volunteered in the Mojave Desert doing some work with a wildlife water project. So this is a picture of an artificial water hole called a guzzler. And this particular guzzler is designed, it's kind of a circular concrete apron. And when rain lands on it, it doesn't go down into the dirt. It just flows along just like your driveway. It drains down into looks like a gutter towards the back. And that gutter leads into a tank that wildlife can access water throughout the year. Like months after the last rain, there's still hundreds of gallons in there. So 20 minutes of hard rain creates hundreds of gallons of water that can be accessed in the heat of the summer, which is pretty valuable. So the Mojave Preserve, they had these artificial water holes. I was out there because I was working with the guzzlers on Camp Pendleton. There are guzzlers that collect rainwater. There are also guzzlers that collect runoff for like bighorn sheep. You can collect a lot more runoff if instead of collecting raindrops, if you're collecting that flash flood that comes down the gully and you're directing it towards a big reservoir. You can collect a lot of water really quickly and preserve it and impound it, and then wildlife has access to that water. So I looked at that as a great innovation that if you are thinking about an innovative way to harness a limited resource, you can have that resource throughout the year if you're clever about it. Next slide. So this is a picture of me at Camp Pendleton. We're installing a fiberglass guzzler. And that guzzler, we put it in a strategic spot that we knew would get used by deer. There was a goal for that. So the guzzlers on Camp Pendleton, that's Camp Pendleton's oldest conservation program. It dates back to when Camp Pendleton was just forming as a base in the 1940s. And some of the guzzlers predate the base. They're part of the ranching era. These artificial water holes were fed. Some of them were fed by springs that were used by the ranchers. And these guzzlers would give water to deer, quail, bobcats, lions, about 50 different species if you added all the owls and, raccoons and everyone that would show up, even badgers too. And what I noticed looking at these guzzlers is for this thesis I did is I had 36 points, 36 locations that I would do a census of what was living there just by looking at the tracks and the trail camera images I had set up at these different spots. Were deer living there? Were mountain lions living there? Were bobcat there? Were quail there? And I could tell you at any given spot, hey, this area gets deer in the winter, but not in the summer, or something like that. And what some trends I found were that deer on Camp Pendleton, they moved from a little higher in elevation in the winter, and they moved lower in elevation in the summer. So maybe closer to the coast, maybe more moderate temperature, more food available for them. The quail, they moved from living everywhere during the wet season. And when I say summer and winter, I probably should be saying wet season and dry season for Camp Pendleton. So the wet season, the quail will be living everywhere on base, and then the dry season would come and they'd congregate to these dry riverbeds that the plants there still had their roots into the water table. So they were getting their food, cover, and water from that. And I could map where the bobcats were going to be just by mapping where the quail were going to be. The bobcats go everywhere the quail are at. So you can't find any bobcats where there's no quail. And then the lions would go wherever the deer went to. So everyone was chasing their resources seasonally, moving back and forth. I was flying in a helicopter counting deer and buffalo, and we do that every year, and it would take 3 days, and it's a lot of work. And so what we do is we'd ask for volunteers to help count, and one of the archaeologists signed up to volunteer, and so we were flying over Camp Pendleton in these transects, and he was pointing out archaeological sites on Camp Pendleton. And there was a fire that had gone through one of these areas, so you could see the dirt, the soil really clearly. And he was pointing out midden soil, which I was not familiar with at the time. And midden soil represents the soil where a historic camp was at. The soil was discolored compared to the surrounding soil because the indigenous people would have fires there. There would be maybe grease from the food that was going to the soil. It was just a different color. It was darker in color than the surrounding soil. And these locations were near sources of acorns. They were near water. They were near milling sites. And it struck me like, hey, these uh, people, just like animals, need to live where their resources are at. And so, just coming as a wildlife biologist, I wasn't looking at anthropology or archaeology yet, but I just had that in my head that people we live similar lifestyles, as long and more primitive times, or more traditional times, I should say. So I came away with thinking that resource equals life. So as long as you're by the resources, you can survive. Next slide. I went to Afghanistan during the surge in 2010 and 2011. I was in Ghazni, which was in the desert, the high desert, about 4,000 feet in elevation. And instead of being an engineer building bridges, my job was to work with the local government, and we were reopening the schools the Taliban had closed down. We were helping with the agricultural economy, trying to help bring stability to the region so folks could make a living through agriculture instead of working with the insurgency, and restoring governance. So getting the people that were government employees, getting them to come to work. Those were my three jobs. And so the farmers, they grew a great wheat crop in the summer, but this particular year they were really excited because they had a rare opportunity to grow a winter wheat crop. And so we didn't always get snow at the 4,000-foot level in eastern Afghanistan, but this year we got a couple feet of snow, and the farmers told us, hey, if we get the right wheat seed, we can grow a winter wheat crop, and that'll be really good for our economy, because when the snow melts, it super saturates the soil and it becomes kind of muddy. And then we could sow our seeds in it. And just with that one initial watering, we could grow a crop of winter wheat. And it's a bonus crop. So it's great for us. Everyone loves that. So we arranged for some rust resistant wheat seed to come in, and that would just be healthier wheat for them. And we gave it to the government. The government distributed. We were trying to build up their government at the time. The government distributed to the farmers, and you can see their winter wheat crop there. So this picture was taken in the spring, and there's an Afghan police truck, and then there's some infantry. They're hunkered down behind that dirt wall, and then behind that dirt wall, there's the winter wheat. So I saw how you could have a local innovation create a resource or additional resources when there wasn't one before. Next slide. One of the best family vacations I ever went on was to Peru. And, in hindsight, it was crazy going there in 2020, 2021, before the vaccines for the COVID travel was different back then, but it turns out it was a good time to go because we were like the only ones in Peru at the time, it felt like. So we got a good chance to visit all the archaeological sites there, the Inca sites with the terraced fields in the mountains. So these mountainside terraces, they took slopes that you couldn't grow food on, and with the rocks, which are plentiful in the area, the locals they built these rock walls, and they filled behind these rock walls soil, and then instead of having a non-productive steep slope, they had acres of arable land. And there's floating islands in Lake Titicaca that are still there today. And people choose to live on these islands because they like the lifestyle, a traditional lifestyle they have. And even on these floating islands, they make out of reeds. They grow food on that as well. They have gardens, and they fish as well. So, we saw the terraced fields, we saw the floating islands in the Nazca area, the famous underground aqueducts that take the water from the base of the mountains where the water table is closer to the surface, and they dig down, they get to the water table, and then they create a underground canal that leads to their farm fields. It's just incredible innovation. So with all these innovations, they were able to bring land or water, all these things in order to have food, which is what they would need to feed their families, raise their kids. This particular picture on the left is of a geoglyph near Paracas. It's called the candelabra. And it's not one of the Nazca lines, but it is a geoglyph near Nazca. It's in Paracas. The locals there, the tour guides will tell you it's called the candelabra because it looks like it's a candelabra, but nobody's under the impression that the people that built that were using, candelabras. This is just something that was named that it's these three long lines with a base at the bottom and what looks like maybe flames. But the closer you look, the longer you look at it, it doesn't look like a candelabra. It just kind of resembles it, you know, so that's how it got its name. So we went and visited this candelabra, and then we were fortunate enough to fly over the Nazca lines. You could see the Nazca lines really well from the air. You could also see the Nazca lines well from the ground as well. Like we were on a bus going from Lake Titicaca to the Nazca area, and it was an overnight bus. And the sun rose, and my daughter was sitting next to me, and we looked out the window, and we saw on the hill these figures on the hill, and you could see them so easily, just like you were driving on the 101 looking at the Hollywood Hills sign. And those were our first glimpse of the Nazca line. And we were driving past Nazca lines that we couldn't see from the bus because they were best seen from air. But if you were on those hills looking back down, you could see those big lines. Just like if you were to stand at the Hollywood Hills sign, you could look down at the 101 and see the freeway there. So you can see the Nazca lines without a plane, but it's easier to see them from a plane. So we were lucky enough to fly over the Nazca lines. I'm not sure whether we were the first tourists to do so after the reopening of COVID, but when they opened up the airport, it was a good sized airport, like 12 gates or so. We were the only ones there. They opened up the security checkpoint for us, and somebody else came in. They asked if they could cut the line because they were the mechanic for our airplane. So we let them through. And then, you know, the only plane to take off that day was that plane giving us a tour. And we flew over the Nazca lines. And I kept thinking, well, what is the purpose of these Nazca lines? You know, you could read about it. You could read that maybe they were, you know, the famous alien connection, you know, that these were alien landing strips, but, you know, do alien landing ships need landing strips, and do they need that many landing strips? And what about the ones on the hills? Because you can't land on the ones on the hill. You know, it just doesn't make sense for a lot of reasons, at least to me. And then the other one was that they're used for ceremonial dances, but there are Nazca lines on the hillside that you can't dance on. So no one explanation seemed to explain all of it. So as we were flying over the Nazca lines, I remember looking at a spiral Nazca line, and it reminded me of the circular agricultural fields you see when you fly over the Southwest United States. And then you could see this the shape of it from the air, and you could see an eroded creek bed that went through the spiral. So you could see that water flowed through there. And I thought, well, what if these were just excavated gardens? You know, these Nazca lines could be filled with dirt, just like, you know, indigenous farmers filled soil behind the rock walls and the mountains, and they created garden beds here that could be watered with that rare runoff event, which could be used quite usefully, just like we use in the Mojave with the guzzlers. And if it happened occasionally, you know, that's good enough. Just like the Afghan farmers growing their winter wheat with just one watering. So I thought, well, maybe these Nazca lines are like some sort of agricultural technique that takes advantage of the runoff. And so I thought maybe this innovation created a resource. So I came back from my vacation, and I couldn't shake the thought of that. And so I started doing little experiments. I filled a Home Depot bucket with soil and some quinoa seeds, and just, you know, watered it once, and then quinoa grew, and you know, 6 weeks later, you know, you could eat the quinoa. So I thought, okay, you could grow food, you could grow traditional Peruvian food, you know, with just one watering. And I made little clay models and looked at how the water after the runoff would flow into these Nazca lines. And just like this candelabra, you can imagine heavy rain. You know, what looks like the candle flames are kind of designed where it would capture all the runoff and it would divert it into these long lines, which might be filled with soil and could be sowed with seeds and maybe grow some food there. So I put all that together in a presentation, and I wasn't an archaeologist. You know, I'm studying to be one, but I thought I'll put it in a presentation. I'll send it to the 10 researchers that are currently working on the Nazca lines, you know, and I try my best to reach out and put a personal touch to this and say, here, please check out this presentation. Because I knew they probably got all sorts of different ideas about what the Nazca lines are. And I tried to differentiate myself by using logic and the scientific method and things like that. And I didn't hear back from any except for one. And he wrote back and he said, cool vacation, bro, but it doesn't rain there. And I was excited that he wrote back, and I said, hey, check out this paper. It says it did rain more there in the past. There's even trees that are still standing in the Nazca area. They're just all dried and died, and, you know, they don't decompose there because of the weather. And you know, a few years ago, the road flooded near the Nazca lines and washed out part of the road. So it does rain there. And then he just didn't write back after that. So then I made a YouTube video, and I never did that before. So I wasn't good at it, but I made a little video, put it on YouTube. It went a little viral. And then I ended up on the front page of the Orange County Register, our local newspaper here. And it was a slow news week. And it got picked up on a bunch of other newspapers. And eventually I got a call from the History Channel to come talk about the Nazca lines. And I was just flattered and excited. So I did. I went and said, hey, these might be a type of permaculture, you know, where you put in garden beds where they're naturally going to get irrigated and they don't take a lot of extra inputs. And so that was my Nazca line chapter of my life. And my wife is glad that that was over and I got it out of my system. And I went back to my regular life thinking, okay, that's good. And I did learn looking at all the stuff that we had our own geoglyphs in Southern California, like the Blythe intaglios or the Topak maze, or these different things that, you know, are kind of under the radar for even local Southern Californians. Next slide. So I was an Army reservist. I was jumping out of a C-130 airplane in El Centro over the desert, coincidentally, and my parachute didn't fully open. So that picture, I took that picture, but that's of a parachute that's about to open, that's opening. But my parachute was just twisted, you know, closer to the canopy. It was in a bunch of twists. And I was working on untwisting it. I had a bunch of things to do. I had to lower my equipment and my weapon and all this stuff. And we were jumping super low. You know, the Army, they make parachuting unfun. You know, you wake up so early, you practice all these different things, you're uncomfortable. You got to go to the bathroom, but they don't let you go to the bathroom. And you know, you're sitting in the aircraft, you go around in circles and it's hot and you jump out. And so you're just focused on getting everything done and all that. But we jump really low because ideally in a military situation, you want to just blanket the ground with troops without a warning. You know, it's all very fast and it takes place very quickly. So that's why we did that. But it didn't work out for me because I just hit the ground so hard before I could fix my parachute and pull the reserve. And so I couldn't stand up. A helicopter came and got me. It took me to UCSD and I spent a few nights in the ICU. And then I came home and then I learned how to use a walker and learned how to use a cane. And I was like 44 at the time. And so this is all, you know, pretty dramatic for me and my family. And so I'm still doing physical therapy. I can't run or jump to this day. So I had to retire as a chief game warden at Camp Pendleton, had to retire from the Army Reserves. But the good news is I had more time with my family. I had health care for my family. I had income for my family with the retirement. And so then I got to do something to fill my time, which is whatever I wanted to do, which was pretty neat. So I thought, you know, I want to go study archaeology. I want to study the geoglyphs. You know, I'm not going to Peru to do this. I'm going to do this in Southern California. And at the same time, because my wife said, well, you do need to get a job, that I was so fortunate to get a job as a part-time consultant at VCS Environmental, great company. All right, next slide, please. Oh, so I'm going back to school. I started with a Harvard Extension School. And so that's my background and why we're here talking about the geoglyphs. So instead of putting the references at the end of the presentation, like as if they're an afterthought, I put them like right in front of the section I'm going to be addressing them, because without these references, you know, we'd be lost. It's just so nice that people take it seriously enough to publish papers so that we can look towards them in the future, and it's a legacy of knowledge that's not lost. I colored a couple of these red because these are old ones. You know, some of these sources I'm using are old. Ruth Benedict, she's a heavyweight in the ethnography field. She came through and met with the survivors of the Serrano culture and put together an ethnography. Edward Brown, he wrote about the Intaglio Mounds of Wisconsin in 1910. And if he didn't do that, I wouldn't know about them because they're now gone due to development. Next slide. So some newer ones, the Feathers paper talking about IRSL dating of rocks. It's a neat way to date rocks that haven't seen the sunlight in a while. So you get a dark room over these rocks. You don't expose them to the sunlight, and then you could do some measurements and see when the last time they were exposed to sunlight, and maybe date a geoglyph based on that. The Fisher paper, just some different views on how agricultural societies developed architecture. So in this case, Fisher says, hey, farmers had to clear their fields of rocks. And so they took the rocks out of their fields and they put them somewhere and they stacked them up somewhere in a spot they weren't farming. And that stack became a pyramid. And the pyramids became, through cultural elaboration, more significant for them. So that was an example of agricultural techniques, leading to architecture. All right, next slide. It looks like this is going to be a long presentation, but I'm just showing you like some of these where we're coming from, because I'm the next section is not me talking about my opinion. It's all just summarizing what I've been fortunate enough to read. So the Nielsen and Christensen paper discusses ancient manuring and how you can look at a potential ancient farm and have some sort of science tell you whether you're probably looking at an old farm or probably not, by looking at the phosphate and the elements that are still in the soil for hundreds of years later. So it's kind of neat. And I try to come up with this through multidisciplinary lenses here. Just my background as a geologist and all these biologists. So, looking at pollen evidence, is trying to identify weather patterns in the Mojave. And then some of you might have seen it keeps coming up in my Google feed, the Japanese scientist, Sakai, down at the bottom, his lab is using AI to find more and more Nazca lines all the time. So that's neat. Next slide. It's nice that there's new research going on with these geoglyphs. And these Sutton papers, man, these are right up my alley, talking about the Desert Serrano, the Mojave Desert. So thank you, PCAS, for publishing these. Next slide. All right, so let's talk about the geoglyphs. All right, geoglyphs are worldwide, not just in Southern California, not just in South America, but there's the Uffington white horse, which is in the UK. It's about 3,000 to 4,000 years old, and maybe it was an emblem for the area. It's a very archaeological rich area, so these the people that built this may have used that as an emblem. But the unusual thing is, it's not easily seen from the landscape. So we're looking down on it from above, but you can see it's kind of on the hilltop. And if you were standing where that individual is standing, you wouldn't know what you were looking at necessarily. So some speculate that maybe if you're looking at the horse from a distance and the sun is setting behind it, maybe it represents something in that way. But that's just speculation. No one knows for sure. Maybe it's connected to the solar system somehow, just through the way it's aligned. And the neat thing about this is what we do know is that subsequent cultures adopted this as something important to them because they lived near it, they took care of it. And it didn't mean the same thing to them as it did to the people that built it. So today it's very important to the people that live there, but they couldn't tell you why it was originally created. The Blythe intaglios, I know some of us have been to those. Those are approximately 2,500 years old. They're in Southern California. The legend is that giants were warned not to fall, and these giants did fall, and they were stuck to the ground. So that's why they're these geoglyphs that are on the ground in Blythe. They're fixed to the desert. And that site is traditionally used for ceremonial dancing. The Wisconsin geoglyphs I mentioned when we were going through the biography, they're now destroyed due to development, but they're located near ancient farming plots and they're positioned near river systems. And the archaeological significance, we don't know because it's been, those sites have been lost due to modern construction. And the geographic patterns of the geoglyphs in the Southwest are typically along river systems. That's typically where people live as well. So that's maybe more than just coincidental there. And the strategic placement suggests the practical and cultural importance for these geoglyphs. Sitgreaves, when he was coming through the area in 1862, his Comanche scouts interpreted the geoglyphs as a warning and told him to turn back. And the human people nearby, they traditionally use geoglyphs as ceremonial dancing locations. So geoglyphs mean different things to different people over time. There's not a universal purpose for geoglyphs. You could say just from this research. Modern research methods like those physics-based techniques are now employed to determine the age of the geoglyph constructions, which can help identify which cultures created them. And artificial intelligence is now helpful at identifying new geoglyphs, which have been lost to time. Next slide. All right, let's talk about the Mojave Desert and climate and humans. Here's a picture of the Mojave Desert. And there's a dry lake bed in the distance, and maybe in the past, and not too distant in the past, that might have been an actual lake. So research shows that there was more rain in the Southwest United States 800 to 3,000 years ago than we experience today. And that's coming from stalactite data, where you might have heard of tree ring data, where you can measure the growth of trees over time to identify how much precipitation was going on while that tree was growing. Well, the stalactites grow based on precipitation as well. They're connected to precipitation, so you can measure the deposits of these stalactites and figure out what kind of precipitation levels we saw in the distant past. There's Mojave archaeological research that shows the indigenous people harvesting freshwater mussels in the Mojave, freshwater mussels. So you have to have a consistent water source for that to happen. And farming goes back about 1,100 years in the Mojave. As the climate dried up, human settlements, they concentrated around where resources remain, these pockets of water, these oases, like Afton Canyon. So instead of seeing more dispersed people, almost like the quail on Camp Pendleton during the dry season, they moved to refuges where there were resources. Next slide. All right, I'm going to talk about rock art because geoglyph art is rare compared to rock art. So if I'm looking at geoglyphs from an artistic standpoint, it makes sense to learn about the petroglyph art. Petroglyphs are created using a chisel on these rock surfaces, flat surfaces. You chisel away the outer surface, which reveals a different color underneath. So there's a contrast, which creates the artwork. And they're typically found near water sources, trail systems, hunting grounds, milling features, rock shelters, where people are spending a lot of their time. And the cultural significance behind these, they might be related to shamanic visions, puberty rituals, ceremonial dancing, or celestial observations, maybe significant constellations. Triangles are very rare with geoglyphs, or with these petroglyphs. So it's interesting. Next slide. Desert food production. You can live in the desert and you can grow food. The ethnography of the Mojave farmers that I read said they never went hungry. There was always plenty of food to go around. Some of the drought adaptation studies are interesting. So 35 African cultures were studied in an arid environment, and the researchers wanted to identify trends or commonalities in how these different cultures succeeded in surviving drought. And they came up with a couple. So successful cultures that want to overcome drought, they stayed in touch with their neighbors. So if they were having a hard time and their neighbors were doing okay, maybe they could support each other. So there was some community resiliency built in there. So you could not be isolated and survive drought long term. You know, eventually the drought would get you. And then they implemented localized water management techniques. So they didn't use the same techniques as their neighbors. What worked for their neighbors might not work as well for them. So everyone had very distinct, very localized water techniques, but they stayed in touch. They just diversified their relationships to exchange resources through trade. In the Nazca area, we talked about those underground aqueducts, but one thing that's interesting about them is they had spiral-shaped pathways down to the aqueducts, and some speculate that that might channelize the wind, just the way they're oriented, which might direct the air into the canals to push the water downstream, propel the water. These aqueducts allowed the people in the Nazca area to live there and live in a very inhospitable spot, but it put them in a very strategic spot trade-wise, where they could be in the middle between the Andes and the coastline. So they could be the people that would help facilitate that trade. And a similar thing was happening in the Mojave. The Mojave River Valley was the route through the desert. So the people living along the Mojave in these oases were doing something similar. Water runoff. I talked about water runoff feeding the guzzlers, but you can use water runoff to irrigate your crops. Other cultures have done it. Ancient Jordanian systems, 2,000 to 6,000 years ago, They constructed dams, sluices, and reservoirs. Ancient Israelis captured hillside runoff for crop irrigation. The Nabateans, they built check dams across desert channels, and that would create localized flooding over prepared fields. When there was a rare rain event, the water, like in a flash flood, would come rushing down the gully. It would hit the dam, would back up, flood the banks, and that's where the field was. And so the field wouldn't get washed away like in a quick event. It would be saturated with this gradual flooding. Ancient Libyans grew crops with less than 1 inch of annual rainfall. In the North American desert agricultural tradition, the Hohokam created arable land by diverting flood waters over cobblestones. So here comes the flood, send it over this flat area with cobblestones. The cobblestone slows down the water flow, which will drop its sediment load. And then you would have arable land where you didn't have arable land before. They would also build check dams across the drainages to create localized floods for irrigation. The Mojave farmers, they utilized the wide river channel, and the Mojave River would flood every year and recede every year, just like the Nile. So when the Nile receded, the farmers planted their crops. When the Mojave receded, the farmers planted their crops in the mud, and they would be able to grow corn and other crops. It was a family-based agricultural system. So in conclusion, for desert food techniques, localized innovation enabled successful food production in these desert environments, and all these different diverse techniques were developed independently across multiple regions. Just because we're not familiar with it doesn't mean that other people couldn't come up with different techniques that we haven't heard of before. And archaeological evidence demonstrates sophisticated understanding of environmental conditions. So these people, they were surviving there because they knew about their environment and they knew how to leverage their resources. Next slide. Here's a petroglyph depicting a bighorn sheep in the Afton Canyon area. So the Desert Serrano culture is associated with the Afton Canyon area. The reason it's documented by Spanish explorers in 1776 when they came through that area. Spanish explorers documented 700 Desert Serrano living in that area, and the settlements were organized linearly along the Mojave River in these different oases. So there's little villages near each oasis. The Spanish and Mexican colonial policies severely disrupted their traditional way of life, and by the 1830s, the Desert Serrano villages were largely abandoned. That's why we know so little about them. Subsistence patterns, they primarily followed a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, so they're not known for farming. They specialize in extracting resources from the river and the desert, and they engaged in trade along the Mojave corridor. They did not cultivate crops, so they did smoke wild tobacco that they found, but they didn't cultivate it. Some of the religious and ceremonial practices that they're known for, they created dedicated cemeteries in their main villages. They practiced both burial and cremation at different periods, and their villages typically contained a sweat house. They conducted male and female initiation ceremonies connected to the rock art. The girls' initiation ceremony involved burial in hot sand, where the boys, they were initiated by consuming a hallucinogenic datura-based drink. Boys would dance until they were overcome by the drug, and the next day, the boys would participate in a race, and the winner of the race was taught the sacred eagle dance. Other ceremonial practices, they held annual feasts requiring specific food contributions such as mesquite or seed flour. They performed Thanksgiving ceremonies for the first seasonal harvests, and they conducted specific ceremonies for mourning, naming, deer hunting, and eclipses. Further, for mourning rituals, the deceased were brought to a ceremonial house, and they'd follow up the ceremonies by destroying the deceased belongings. Shamans experienced visions and dreams, possibly induced by datura, a plant. The sons of the chiefs and potential shamans participated in annual shamanic ceremonies. Healing practices included sucking techniques, herbal remedies, and use of insect bites. And we don't know a lot about the Desert Serrano culture. Our information is extremely limited. The majority of the cultural knowledge has been lost. Anthropologist Ruth Benedict gathered information from survivors in 1922, but even then, the meaning of the rock paintings and ceremonial songs was uncertain to the survivors. All right, next slide. So presentation, the last part of it is talking about my research plan. So I have a research question. My research question is, what do these geoglyphs tell us about an ancient culture? And I have 5 sub-questions, well, actually 6 sub-questions that I've created based on different proposals of what geoglyphs are for throughout the world. So one is, do they have an astronomical purpose? Do they line up with stars or eclipses and, eclipses that took place in the past? So there's different directions that these took place. Do they represent a previously unknown desert agricultural technique? I kind of alluded that with my Nazca line theory, but I've evolved. I want to tell you that I'm not trying to say, oh, I have this idea and I'm trying to prove my idea. I've stepped back from that, and the great classes that I'm taking right now have given me better insight. And you design an experiment to gather the data, and then you follow where the data goes. You don't design an experiment to prove that you're right. So I'm very much open to what the data is going to show. And do these have a connection to a known prehistoric religious tradition? So I'm limited there. I'm going to be looking at ethnographies and reaching out to resources that may have recorded religious traditions. Do they have a connection to a known prehistoric artistic tradition? So I'll primarily be looking at the petroglyphs in the area that have survived. Do they point to significant landmarks? So these are triangles. I would, maybe this is wrong, but I interpret them as like pointing at something. So I'll just follow the location they point at to see if that is anything significant. And do they represent a combination of these purposes? So, today religion is separate for some of us than a lot of different things, but food and religion are very closely linked together. Art and religion, I mean, you can't separate religion from the cosmology of this culture. All right, next slide. So I'm gonna, oh, sorry, can you go back one? So I have these 5 research questions. Oh, yeah, there we go.
Yes.
Good job. And I'll be gathering quantitative data, so data that you can count, like how much phosphate is in the soil, what direction does this geoglyph point, and then I'll have qualitative data, like how does this connect to petroglyphs that are in the area? How does this connect to religious practices that have been written about? I'm going to bring those two together in a convergent data analysis, bring it together, and then come up with a warranted conclusion. And it's not going to be like, it's black and white. It's this. It's probably going to be something like, it's more likely this, it's less likely that, something like that. Next slide, please. So the qualitative research I'll be doing, I'll be looking at Mojave past food production practices, religious practices related to geoglyphs and triangles and triangular rock art. That's the datura plant, and you can see how it's growing in clumps, that was a culturally significant plant to the Desert Serrano. Next slide. The quantitative data, this is a mass spectrometer machine is going to analyze those samples. So I plan on it, this is my plan. My plan is to if I get everything works out, to collect soil samples of the geoglyphs and next to the geoglyphs and see if there's any difference in these elements that would have been stripped if this was a little garden plot, or that would have been added if there was soil added, phosphates and those types of things. I'm going to measure the directions of the azimuths of these geoglyphs and where they're pointing in relation to the surrounding landscape features and astronomical events that would have been significant. So the ethnography that I've read talks about the Orion constellation and eclipses. So I'll be looking at things like that have happened in the past, and do they line up with these geoglyphs? water runoff patterns. So I don't know, but maybe these geoglyphs are all pointing in a different direction because the water runs off in just slightly different directions. Water runs downhill, but downhill is just a slightly different angle, maybe in all these different spots. And water percolation testing. So one thing I didn't mention about the Nazca lines is that has a really lime-rich soil that sets up like cement. And so the water just flows right over it. It doesn't soak into it. So there's a lot of runoff. Maybe the same thing is at these geoglyphs where the rain would fall on this location and it would just flow off. It wouldn't soak in there. So I'll do a percolation test. And I'm hoping that this new information will give some new context to these geoglyphs. Next slide. So the data analysis might look something like this. We have an astronomical hypothesis. Okay, so we wouldn't expect the slope to be to have a pattern in the slope because these are pointing at the stars. We wouldn't expect percolation to be important. We would expect a directional connection to these events. We wouldn't think there'd be a difference in chemistry between the geoglyphs and the non-geoglyphs. And we would think that the ethnography would support that an astronomical connection to the geoglyphs. Now, if you look at agriculture, we would expect to see a pattern with a slope, or they should be pointing down slope with runoff. We'd expect there wouldn't be much percolation. We'd expect the that's a typo. There wouldn't be it wouldn't be pointing in directions. And then chemistry, we would expect chemistry difference between the control and then the geoglyphs. And then the ethnography, we would expect to see some evidence of a plant that could be grown with a single watering that was significant to the culture. So you have these different yeses, you have these different nos, but the nos are important as well. For example, like if you have if you wanted to say this was an agricultural technique, but there wasn't a chemical difference, well, then that would be significant. It's not just the yeses we're paying attention to, it's the nos as well. And so I would follow that across and I would say, here's the conclusion. This one is probably more likely to be supported by the evidence, or this is less likely to be supported by the evidence. And I'm humble enough to know that whatever I come up with is not the truth. It is just an interpretation of the data that I've collected. So I'm just working on trying to collect the best data and doing it as rigorously as possible so that it can be repeated if necessary. And next slide. All right, so I am, all this work is before I've done my thesis proposal. My thesis proposal process begins this fall. And then next year I'll be conducting the thesis. 25, 26, I got it confused because it just seems like it's so far in the future, but I'll be finishing this all up in 2026. All right, one last slide, and it's my summary. Go ahead and flip to the next slide. So I was talking to my son about what does this presentation mean and like what is the so what about this? And here's what the so what is. I mean, these geoglyphs, they represented something significant to people who lived in Southern California, and we don't know what it is. Maybe we can learn a little bit more about these people that lived in the past. These geoglyphs aren't going to be around forever. Like we've seen them, I've seen them damaged in front of my own eyes, from the satellite image that looked like good geoglyphs. And we went out there and there's tracks going over them. It would be nice to learn about them and maybe draw attention to them so that they are preserved and there's more value. And what a great opportunity for archaeology to highlight something impressive or learn something about our own local cultures here. So I appreciate the PCAS, the past publications that have informed my research so far, and I'm happy to be speaking to you today and hopefully moving forward in that same tradition. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you everyone on Zoom for hanging in there. But I'll typically take questions now. Is that right? John, I see you raise your finger. Go ahead.
Where are you a student at? I joined late because I missed the call.
I'm at the Harvard University Extension School, which I humbly said is associated with Harvard, but everyone can take classes there. But if you take classes there and you meet certain requirements, you could become a matriculated student. And so that I go back to Boston pretty regularly. And all my classes, it's kind of like this, you know, I'm attending online, a lot of them. And so that's what I'm doing. That's through the Harvard University Extension School.
So are you working full time?
I work part-time and I go to school part-time.
Okay. Well, good luck. This is really, really interesting. This is I joined late, but I got a good sense of what it's going. And this business of, I was looking up Dutira or do whatever however you pronounce it.
Datura.
Obviously, I know most of us don't call it by that name. We've got another name for it,
Mhm.
And I've had like 50 years ago when I was young, we had friends of friends try it, and one of them's gone
Oh
because
my
of it.
goodness.
Yeah,
Wow.
I mean it's bad stuff.
Yeah.
If you don't know how to use it, obviously. So
Yeah, it's related to the angel trumpet plant, which is like this decorative plant that we have in our house. And my wife was trimming the plants, and then she took her glove off and wiped her eye. And then hours later, her eye pupil dilated, and we thought she was having a stroke. And this is during COVID, so we had to drop her off at the emergency room. And they let her go a day later, not understanding what it was. And then we thought, maybe it was that plant. And we looked it up, and yep, the same properties that are in that plant are in the drops that dilate your eyes. So yeah, that plant is definitely potent.
yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question for you. Is there any other place that has these triangular geoglyphs other than that one spot that you found in the desert?
I thought the spot that I found that was damaged by off-roaders, I thought that was triangular, but when I got there, I couldn't validate that. I haven't seen triangles just like this in any other spots. There's different designs that can be interpreted like as a snake or things like that. I haven't seen the triangles like this. I I'm gonna try and have an opinion on what these geoglyphs mean, but clearly it would be just related to these triangular geoglyphs because other geoglyphs would be very different. So yeah, they're very different, each one of them.
And did you find any lithics or pottery or anything within those triangular geoglyphs?
I've been out there briefly. I don't have a permit to conduct this research. So I was just there to verify that these were intact, and I did not do anything, any sort of excavation or anything like that. But there was nothing laying on the surface that
Okay.
I could see.
Michael Al Knight here, if I may.
Hi, Al.
Interesting. I haven't been out to Afton Canyon in a while, but as you know, as you were saying, there's a zillion sites all through there. So there's got to be some kind of association, even if it isn't immediate. I would have liked to have seen more pictures of the triangles. Your presentation was excellent. Lots of interesting stuff from lots of different places, but your subject is the triangles. And again, having been out on the desert quite a bit, I never noticed one of those things. I'd like to know more about them.
Yeah, sorry about that, Al. It was I went out there once. I took some pictures, and I plan on being out there a lot more, and I'll have a lot more pictures soon.
Well, come back in a year and give another presentation.
Year or two.
One
Yeah.
thing off the top of my head, kind of, I study rock art. I make a pretense of studying rock art. When I started studying rock art 30 years ago, or maybe a little longer, cupules in Southern California were considered extremely rare in most places. And now we know of quite a few sites with cupules. If you don't know what you're seeing, you're not looking for it, your mind's on the flowers like the datura, you could walk right by quite a few cupules and not see them. I think the same thing with those things. I suspect there's more of them out there, and people are just not keyed into them, especially the smaller ones. When you
Mhm.
said a foot or two, I was like, holy mackerel. And they are similar to petroglyphs, the ones that you were looking at, in the contrast. If you were going to do something like that with rocks, make a triangle, trying to collect water, whatever, in an area where when you remove the rock or move the soil around, the background, what you were exposing was the same color. There could be a lot of them out there, assuming that they were put in areas, say, to collect water and not to make a visual statement.
Right.
But like many petroglyphs, or certainly petroglyphs of basalt, the ones that you showed us pictures of, those are making a visual statement. It's like, okay, once you notice it, wow, there it is.
Yeah.
And go look. I bet you spend some time on Google Earth, don't you?
I used to spend more, but after, it seems like it's a big desert, but after a while, like you get to know it pretty good. But yeah, I think these are a good example of well-preserved geoglyphs. There's other geoglyphs out there that might be harder to get to, that are not easily accessible on public land. So I know I was looking for someplace on public land. There are lots of geoglyphs out there, just like if you're trying to look for certain wild animals that have certain habitat needs. If you were to look at these rivers, move along the rivers, look at the bluffs, you could find these geoglyphs in certain areas. It's just a matter of whether they're suitable for study. And I was trying to find something that was a little more pristine, maybe a little far from the freeway, but not too far, kind of thing.
Yeah. Now you were on Pendleton quite a bit, so you must have seen quite a bit of area desert archaeology. Have you had much of a chance to see more of Afton Canyon itself?
I camped in Afton Canyon. I plan on going back to Afton Canyon. One thing I'm looking forward to is finding these hunting blinds in Afton Canyon and looking at the petroglyphs. There's a lot more to do. It sounds like you spent time there, which is
not nearly enough. I know the desert a little more to the north, over toward the El Paso Mountains and Inyo County and all that. But anyway, good stuff. Thank you for your presentation.
Thanks for listening.
Yeah, I got a question, or actually a point, possibly. My name's Ivan Strudwick. Intaglios, and you mentioned a date, sort of a general date for the Blythe intaglios. And I think, because the first thing I think when I look at new or strange things that are out in the desert, especially the California desert, is that they're recent. That's the first thing that crosses my mind. Doesn't mean it's true, but it just means that it's a possibility. So, or possibly 100 years old or 150 years old. So possibly you can look at known intaglios that have already been dated. And I know that the desert pavement, they say, is brought about by a chemical change in the surface of the rocks that occurs very slowly over time. So it's possible that if you get to know the other intaglios and what they believe they date to, that you can say that yours are the same age or maybe younger or maybe older. And I was just thinking that's a possibility, because that is something I don't think that you discussed in your table, the date.
Yeah, I wasn't planning on looking at the date for the purpose, because that would lead me to do the IRSL test, which for the scope of my project, it's already I have to edit out certain things what I can do, and the date is not as informative for the purpose, I think. I mean, it would be great to know the date, but I was looking at the other lower hanging fruits that I know I could accomplish. But yeah, it would be great to know the date.
But you could just do some generalized. They appear to be younger or they appear to be older than, and that's all.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And your
what are
talk was
intaglios?
excellent.
Thank you.
What are intaglios? How do you spell that?
Intaglio, it's a Spanish word. I use the word geoglyph, which is like a picture on Earth, but intaglio, it goes back to like it refers to like the reverse image that you would use on a printing press to make a print, and it's a Spanish word, so it's usually would be more common in the Southwest to use that than it would be in England or Africa. So it's one of those words that is used. It's often used with the Blythe intaglios, but maybe not with other geoglyphs.
There's some questions in the chat. I don't know if you,
you
Stephen,
give-
are you available to the chat?
Can you please provide, let me say in summary, what is your definition of the data set? What is it that we're really talking about? These are triangular geoglyphs? Use your words for it.
So I have a question from the group
Repeat the
about,
question, yeah.
yeah, what is the data set of the geoglyphs? So these geoglyphs, these triangles, what I plan on doing is collecting the soil samples from the geoglyph and from a control site, and comparing the elements in the two. Like, does one have more phosphate than the other, which would indicate maybe a past agricultural practice? Do these geoglyphs, do they point at, what direction do they point? And then if you scale out on the map, do these geoglyphs point to certain significant points on the landscape, which would be subjective, but if you saw that they all pointed at certain mountaintops, or if they all pointed at certain eclipses that took place over the past centuries, then that would be interesting as well. So having information like that, and then also learning about what plants were grown in the area, could they be grown in these little garden beds, things like that, just the quantitative data and the qualitative data, bringing it together and an analysis to figure out what is more likely explaining these geoglyphs. What do these geoglyphs mean to that culture? Does that answer your question?
Halfway, good.
What's the other half?
My impression is that these are triangular. Why?
I don't know. It could be artistic. So one of the aspects I'm looking at is art. Are there other triangle shapes in art in the area that have survived? Do the triangle itself, does it lend itself to point at something or not? Does it lend itself as a good shape for runoff? This is not part of the study, but just anecdotally, I looked at the triangle as a fantastic way. If you were like, even my own yard, if you look up my yard and from Google Earth, a satellite took a picture of a geoglyph growing chia in my yard. I turned on the garden hose and excavated a little triangle, filled it with soil, and threw chia seed on it, and it grew a crop of chia. It's just the triangle itself. If the water were to hit the point of the triangle, it would erode it away, but it hits the base, it disperses the runoff, and then it doesn't matter how much runoff you get, it's going to spread more evenly because it's a triangular shape, it'll focus it. So that's an example that maybe the triangle is just perfect for runoff agriculture, but I'm not trying to put the cart before the horse. I'm saying I haven't collected the data yet, I don't know why they're triangular, and that's a good question.
The few pictures that you presented suggest triangular. That an area on the desert with rock has been cleared to a triangular shape. I was impressed that these look like cleared.
Yeah, they're cleared.
If there was no, let me say, wall or accumulation at the edge, looks
Today.
like they were cleared.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much we could say about these geoglyphs being in the same condition as they were, whenever they were created, because weathering takes place. Yeah, it's a good question. Like, for example, the Blythe intaglios, they've been restored, and so they're not in the same condition as they were, 100 years ago or 300 years ago. They're in a different condition. Like these geoglyphs, the Nazca lines, for example, they're finding new ones that were previously not clearly visible, but AI said, hey, there's something here. And so people go later and they excavate it to bring it back to life. So the condition of the triangular geoglyphs today, I wouldn't be comfortable saying that, that's probably what they look like when they're first created, because these things change over time, Scott?
Yeah. Follow on that question. How are you going to address the problem of the directional?
Can they come closer to the speaker, please, or the microphone, because nobody can hear what the question is.
Just repeat it. Here, I'll just talk a little louder. Can you hear me now?
I'll repeat it too.
Okay,
So there's a couple of questions here that require you to understand the direction of the triangle, or some element of directionality, right? Pointing at something, or if it's collecting runoff from a large base to a narrow point. Do you have a reason to think that there's a standard way to determine which direction any given triangle?
Yeah, just growing up, going to school here, the triangle points that way, but maybe it didn't. Triangles don't point that way, the same direction. If you look at triangles as a different, grew up differently with them. So I will have to look at the different angles of the lines and see if any of them consistently line up in a way that for what I have available to say, okay, hey, these all point to hilltops. These all point to, the where the sun rises on or the moon sets during this particular time. So yeah, I don't believe that simple, hey, the triangle points in this direction is I can't just leave it at that. I have to look at the different angles that are there. The one thing I can look at pretty easily is just using a clinometer and a clinometer, and then figure out where the slope is. That is pretty easy. But as far as what these things are pointing at, because if you were to say, hey, I bet those geoglyphs are for a calendar of some sort, you would expect to find some sort of pattern in the way these directions are. And if you say, hey, it's this particular line is always pointing to this celestial event, I hope to be able to establish a pattern like that and support that, or say I did not see a pattern, so I can't support that astronomical hypothesis. That's my goal.
Yeah, I think, honestly,
Yeah, I forgot. I'm not repeating these questions. Scott was saying, hey, well, what are you going to measure the triangle? Like, how are you going to say where it's pointing at? Like, you can't just say it's one line, because maybe the people that built these triangles, the triangles, meant something different, and how they pointed somewhere. Maybe the bottom line was more important, or something like that. Or, that wasn't how you explained it. But, and then your second question was you have to look at all three lines, and I get that, but you think that you would see the same line. Like you wouldn't say, oh, the right line on this one, but the left line on this one. Like you wouldn't say, oh no, and if you squint, this almost lines up with this. You'd want to see some sort of consistent pattern, and that's what I'd be looking for. Maybe some of them all might point in the same direction. That would be interesting too.
it might be interesting to think about geometric consistency of the shapes.
Like the ratio. Yeah.
How much they vary.
We're talking about the triangles and whether they're long triangles or proportionally shorter and that type of thing. Yeah.
If you have an equilateral triangle, which point are you looking at?
Yeah, and it happened to not be equilateral. I only know that just because having visited them, that was pretty apparent that they're not equilateral. But as far as like whether some are longer or not, I have to get out there and measure it. But I'm not done yet.
And I had one more observation or question. Sorry to step on the chat. Have you looked in and thought about the progression of the Fremont period agriculture and Great Basin?
can he come closer to the microphone, please?
Yeah. Yeah, just because they're bored listening to just the dead air. So you come over here.
Yeah, I had hey everybody on Zoom. I just had a second question about, I was asking Mike if he had done any background research or thought about Fremont agriculture in Utah and those parts of the Great Basin, and the relationship there between the expansion and contraction at periods of good years when agricultural exploitation of those regions was more possible, and contraction in years when drought advanced, and thinking about how strategies change through time in that context, and how that might help inform thinking about refugia and desertification of the region and the change over time in the climate here. So I'll leave you to answer, but I guess I want to know, have you thought about that, as an avenue for comparison?
Yeah, certainly, from my limited research, the Mojave has changed in abundance of rainfall in the past, and techniques have varied as resources availability changed. So yeah, in the Great Basin, we saw that, and whether the Mojave is directly related to the Great Basin, I don't know enough to say that they're analogous, but I think that the paradigms are the same. Conditions changed over time, and farmers, if they survived, had to change with those conditions. And so I think you'd see that in the Great Basin, you'd see that in the Mojave. So I agree.
Get some questions
All
on the
right.
chat here also.
Thank you.
Want to comment?
Is there any other questions, or I don't see anything in the chat?
Okay, there's some questions in the chat.
Okay.
One from Jeffrey Spivey.
Was
Through
the
the chat?
damaged geoglyph another Mojave geoglyph? Yeah, it was just down the Mojave River, downstream. It's a dry river in that portion, but it was downstream like 8 miles. Yes, it was.
Okay, and also a comment, picking up on Al Knight's question about more photos of the triangles.
Yeah, I owe you that, Al. I promise to get some more. In fact, next time I go out there, I'll have a drone, and that'll be helpful.
Comment. There's a book by Bill Mann's Mysterious Places in the Mojave Desert.
Oh, okay. I'll write that down.
The triangles and the candy cane and the concentric circles that are a little bit, a couple miles northwest of the triangles.
The candy cane, is that something that is it on the ground, or? Okay, the geoglyphs are near the Mojave River, so they're connected in that way. But as far as like the purpose, I don't know if there's a connection there, because I don't know the purpose of these geoglyphs, but I imagine they may have been put there for similar reasons. Yeah.
Being stupid, where is I don't want mean to be stupid, but where does the Mojave River flow from and to? Does it come out of Big Bear area and go into the desert and evaporate, or what?
Yeah, it flows in general. It flows, from the mountains in the east towards southwest generally.
And where does it empty into?
Dry lakes near Baker.
Yeah, into nothing right now. It just goes underground and disappears.
Okay. But it's a northwest or northeast southwest flowing river?
Yeah, in general, yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you. That was a privilege. Appreciate it.
Another comment in the chat, intagulo equals removal of soil. And one final question here. We make an assumption that these are native. How are we going to rule out that they may be the creation of desert rats?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there are some geoglyphs that have been attributed to desert rats. Notably, a solar farm was trying to be stopped, and a geoglyph appeared where that solar farm was. But satellite images that go back like more than 5 years ago show that the geoglyph didn't exist there. So, I mean, that's a very good question. And I don't think you'll be able to be 100% sure about things. But the fact that these geoglyphs have been around for enough time, it's a good question. I'm interested in studying these geoglyphs because the BLM has seen them authentic enough to put a steel cable around them. But I don't know enough to tell you why that is right now. It's a good question.
Okay, if there's no other questions.
There's one more question.
Oh, one more.
Oh, there's one more?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah,
What was the question?
most of these triangles seem to be isosceles triangles with a shorter base, and I agree. I saw the same thing. And my email address, you're welcome to email me, Tucker San Diego, like the city, Tucker, my last name, San Diego, @gmail.com. Be happy to talk to any PCS members who have good insight into this because I am new to this field and very humble about it. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, we want to make a presentation to you. And is there somebody there to take a photo?
I'll take the photo.
Okay,
Well, we're gonna be out of the camera. That's okay.
Oh, we could do it with the camera with my son can stand up right behind us.
Yeah,
with his
there we
hat.
go.
Oh, go back a little further. Yeah, fine.
Mike, thanks for addressing
you, Pat.
our
Thank you
group.
very much.
Interesting talk, and we look forward to seeing you in a year.
In a
when
year
you
or two.
talk to us again.
Yeah, I'll have all the answers.
So let's take a picture. Here, you grab it, I guess.
Big smiles. One more.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Oh, just one other bit of information. Our next talk is June 12th. It's Zoom only. Our speaker is Dr. Robert Dello Russo, and his lecture is entitled "Context is Everything: Rupia Serosa and the Dating of the White Sands Footprints in New Mexico."
and if I may,
no more.
that will be our last meeting
Go ahead.
for this program year. We'll start up again in September. There are no meetings in July and August. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Good job.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That was excellent.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Very interesting.
Bye-bye.
Good night, folk.